They laughed when she dug the trench, not because it was funny, but because they needed to. Because when your own roof's sagging under the weight of November snow, and your walls groan like a dying cow with every gust of wind, and your children sleep in their coats, you'll do anything, anything, to believe someone else is worse off than you. So when she began carving a shallow, crooked line in the frozen dirt behind her cabin, folks didn't ask questions, they just whispered. And when she started laying stone, flat, dry-fitted, fire-blackened stone, all the way from her hearth to a pile of pine needles at the edge of her field, folks started saying it out loud, that she was touched, that she'd lost her mind since the blizzard took her husband, that the grief and the cold had hollowed her out so bad she was burrowing like an animal, but they weren't close enough to see the steam. They didn't hear the quiet hum of moving air, the low draw of pressure pulling warmth from the deepest part of her hearth through that long, narrow tunnel and into the ground beneath her floors. They didn't see how her cabin never iced, and they couldn't know, that just a week later they'd be knocking on her door, frostbitten, half-starved, and begging her to let their children come inside. Her name was Martha Jane Elwood, and she wasn't a genius. She didn't read books on convection or build fancy diagrams with charcoal on the walls, but she'd watched her husband sweat over old mining tunnels, watched the way the air moved when you lit a fire deep below and opened a vent at the far end. And she remembered something he once said just before he died in their bed that bitter February night. "Heat's like a scared rabbit. You gotta give it a place to run." So after she buried him, she built him a place to run. At first, it was just a hole she dug behind the hearth, low and sloping, deep enough to crawl through, packed it with river stones and clay, shaped it tight, made it curve under the floorboards. The mouth of it opened into a half-buried chamber she built from logs and sod at the edge of the hill, what she called the lung, and that lung breathed. When she lit her fire, the warm air shot through that tunnel like it was alive, curling under her home, rising into the cracks in the floorboards, lifting the chill from her skirts. It wasn't a draft, it was moving heat, steady and slow, like the gentle exhale of something sleeping just beneath her cabin. But no one believed her, not even when she stood outside in shirt sleeves while the frost curled thick on the neighbors' windows, not even when the Elwood children ran barefoot from the barn to the cabin porch while everyone else's boys coughed up blood from the cold. And so the talk grew mean. "She's got the devil working under her house," someone said. "She's using fire spirits," someone else spat. But come that long freeze in early December, the one that snapped the bones of oxen in their stalls and turned ink to ice inside the inkwells, they came, one by one, wrapped in torn quilts, children in tow, lips cracked and hands shaking. They didn't come with apologies, just with desperation, and she let them in, not because she forgot what they'd said, but because she remembered what it was like to hold her husband's hand as it went cold in hers, all because they'd run out of wood and the wind never stopped screaming through the gaps in the walls. She let them in, and the tunnel breathed. But that night, something else happened, something she hadn't expected. The old man from the edge of town, Samuel Judd, who hadn't spoken to her in a year, was the first to notice. He'd huddled near the hearth, back crooked, blanket drawn over his knees, when he tapped the floorboards beneath him and narrowed his eyes. He asked her what she'd done. She told him. He laughed, wheezed, then shook his head. "You built a flue under your house." "No," she said. "I built a rabbit run." It became the talk of the town the next day, not out of mockery, but something worse, envy. Because while the Elwood cabins stayed warm with barely a log burned, other families were splitting furniture, slaughtering chickens for fuel, burning their hope one stick at a time just to keep their children breathing through the night. And now they wanted in on it. The men came by in twos and threes, hats in hand, asking questions. She answered some, not all. A few tried to copy it, digging holes, building vents, laying stones, but none of them worked. Their homes filled with smoke or froze solid. One tunnel even collapsed, nearly killing a boy who'd crawled inside to chase the heat. And so the whispers turned cruel again. She tricked it, they said. She made a deal. But Samuel Judd, stooped old Samuel, he kept coming back, not just for warmth, but to sit in that cabin and think. He'd bring with him scraps of paper, make diagrams with coal, mutter things like updraft curve and thermal sink, and sometimes just sit in silence watching the flames lick the stone. And every now and then, he'd nod and whisper, "She's got the lungs of a mountain in here." Martha never asked what he meant. She just kept feeding the fire. But it didn't last. Warmth never does. On the first day of true blizzard, when the sky went white and the air turned knife-sharp, something went wrong. The tunnel groaned. Martha felt it, like a giant below her home had shifted in its sleep. The heat changed too, less a soft exhale, more a choke. She checked the hearth. checked the lung, but nothing seemed broken, until the smoke came back, not from the chimney, from the floor, a thin, curling thread of grey rising between the planks, slow at first, then growing thick, dark, choking, and then the floor buckled. Children screamed. A man fell through, straight into the tunnel. Mouth, shoulder shattered on the stone. Martha threw water, dirt, blankets, anything, but the heat kept rising, too fast now, like a fire, running not along wood but through the very breath of the earth itself. Samuel Judd dragged himself to the edge of the hole, staring into it like a man at the mouth of hell. "She tapped something," he whispered. "What?" she snapped. He just shook his head, eyes wide with dread. "There's something down there." And then came the sound, a low, hollow howl from beneath the ground. Not wind, not fire, something else, something old. The tunnel had drawn more than warmth, and now it wouldn't stop breathing. For nearly an hour the floor smoldered. Children were pulled back from the hearth. Adults shoved benches against door frames as if the planks themselves might ignite. The man who fell through, young Charlie Boone, a wheat farmer's son, was dragged out of the breach by the belt, his left arm limp and his eyes rolling. Martha wrapped him in blankets and pressed his palm to her own cheek until his breath steadied. But all the while, the tunnel exhaled that strange warmth, hotter now, unnatural, like air drawn from a kiln instead of a fire. Samuel Judd wouldn't leave the edge of the cracked floor. He sat there mumbling, his hands trembling as he scratched shaky sketches into the soot with a half-charred stick. "It shouldn't breathe like this," he muttered. "Not without a draw point. It needs air, or gravity, or—" He stopped, coughed hard, then wiped his lips. "She's pulled something loose under us, maybe something old." Martha stared down into the breach. The light was strange, not firelight. It had a dull, amber sheen, like oil lanterns seen through thick honey. Every so often, the tunnel pulsed, not with wind, but with rhythm, a beat, a cadence, like a breath or a heart. That night, no one slept. They kept to the far corners of the cabin while Martha kept the fire low. Outside, the storm thickened, snow hammering the walls like fists, the wind so fierce the trees bowed and screamed. But inside, the warmth never faded, not even when the fire burned down to coals. It just lingered, soft and steady, almost too steady. The heat that came through the floor now wasn't reacting to fire. It had become fire. It moved of its own accord, whispering under the floorboards like a voice in another room, a low murmur, no words, just presence. By dawn, a thin crust of ice had formed on every other cabin in town, but the Elwood home steamed. The snow melted on contact with the roof. The porch rails wept with moisture, and the footprints of those inside who dared to leave evaporated within seconds, leaving no trace. That's when the stories began. The first was from old Hetty Ward, who lived 2 cabins east. She came to Martha's door with her eyes wide, dragging her sick grandson wrapped in hides. She didn't knock, just pushed inside and set the boy down by the hearth, breathless, weeping. "He was blue," she sobbed. "I carried him here blue. But the second we came near, the color came back in his cheeks. It rose through him, Martha, like a spring." The boy stirred. His lips, once cracked and gray, pinkened. His hands clenched, then relaxed. He blinked once, twice, then rolled toward the fire. Samuel Judd stood up fast. "It's healing him." "No," Martha said quietly. "It's warming him, that's all." But it wasn't all. Because the heat didn't feel like heat anymore. It felt like a tension. Later that same day, someone knocked, not gently. 3 hard raps, then silence. Martha opened the door to find Reverend Amos Dull, face pale, beard stiff with frost, standing alone with snow up to his thighs. "May I speak with you?" he asked. She stepped aside. He didn't remove his hat, didn't stamp the snow from his boots. He simply crossed the threshold and stopped as if struck. "What is this place?" he asked. "My home." "No," he said, voice low. "It isn't." She narrowed her eyes. "Reverend," he turned to her, and for the first time since she'd known the man, he looked afraid. "I walked past every cabin in town. I prayed over them. I laid hands on walls and spoke psalms. None of them answered. But this place—" He looked toward the hearth, then down at the floor. "This place listens back." Martha folded her arms. "If you came to curse me—" "I came to warn you," he cut in. "Close it." "I can't." "Then bury it, collapse it, seal it with stone and ash and scripture, if you must. But don't let it breathe another day. Whatever you tapped, it's not from this world." She didn't respond. He left without another word. By the 3rd day, there were 17 people sleeping in her cabin. Families brought whatever they could. Smoked meat, spare quilts, even tools. They tried not to talk about the heat. They called it luck or God's mercy or Martha's blessing, but no one looked at the floor for long, except the children. They played by the tunnel mouth, laughed and whispered and leaned close, claiming they could hear the cave talking. One boy said he heard music. A girl said she heard someone crying. They weren't scared. In fact, they began sleeping close to it, curled like pups beside a warm belly. Samuel tried blocking it with boards. The heat just seeped around them. He piled bricks. It lifted them. He finally tried blowing smoke into it to test the airflow, but the smoke never came back. It vanished, swallowed deep into the earth. That night the dog vanished, a big mongrel mutt someone had brought for protection. It had growled the whole first day, circled the hearth endlessly, barked at the tunnel, but just before sunrise it went silent. They found its paw prints in the ash leading up to the breach. Nothing after that, just heat, just that steady, pulsing heat. On the sixth day, Martha couldn't sleep. The snow hadn't stopped. It was now chest high in the yard. Her cabin, once a refuge, felt like a sinking ship. The wood creaked constantly. Every window was shuttered tight. Every breath inside, thick with heat and worry. But what kept her up wasn't the wind or the people. It was the voice, soft, feminine, rising from the tunnel like breath on glass. Not quite a language, not quite a song, but familiar, like the coo of her children when they were babies, like the sound her husband made when he was dying. Gentle, wordless grief. Martha sat at the edge of the breach and listened. For hours, no one disturbed her. Not even Samuel, who kept to his corner, scribbling mad equations on scrap cloth. Not even the others, who now whispered that Martha was the tunnel's bride, that it spoke only to her, that her skin no longer steamed when she stood too close. When the morning came, something changed. The fire had gone out, dead out. No coals, no smoke, no heat from the hearth. But the cabin was warm. Not just warm, hot, like mid-July at midday. And the heat came from below. Samuel was the first to speak. "It doesn't need fire anymore," Martha stood. "It never did." The room went silent. Then, all at once, the shutters clattered open. From the outside, the front door creaked. Cold air rushed in, and a figure stepped through. Not a man, not quite. He was tall, pale, no beard, no snow on his boots. His coat was stitched from canvas, so aged it had gone yellow, like old parchment. He didn't speak, just looked around the room, slowly letting his gaze rest on every face until he settled on Martha. She didn't flinch. He pointed to the breach in the floor. "Old place," he said, voice like wet stone. "Older than this town, older than firewood." "What do you want?" she asked. He smiled. "To warn you." And then he looked around again, eyes tired and deep. "It's waking up? You fed it?" "No," she said. "I built it." He laughed once. "You dug into a lung that still breathes, child, and now it remembers being warm, and now it wants more." He turned to leave. "Wait," Martha called. "What is it?" He didn't answer, just paused at the door. "Don't burn anything else," he said. "No wood, no coal, no ash." "Why?" He looked back over his shoulder, eyes like dying stars. "Because if you do, it'll think it's welcome." Then he vanished into the snow. By the time the last ember died in Martha's hearth, the tunnel was glowing, not with flame, with light, a deep golden pulse that shimmered beneath the planks, no longer flickering like fire, but steady, constant, like the beat of something enormous and awake. No one spoke, no one dared move, because the air was too warm now, thick like soup, and breathing it made you drowsy, made you forget why you were afraid. Martha stood barefoot at the center of the room, the heat curling around her ankles like vines. She didn't shiver, she didn't blink, she just stared into the breach and whispered, "Where do you go, little rabbit?" And the floor answered her. The warmth no longer felt like kindness. It had changed again, subtle but unmistakable. The heat rising through the floor was no longer the kind that chased cold from bones or soothed aching joints. It was too rich now, too saturated, like stepping into the thick breath of something alive. And it wasn't just warmth anymore. It had a weight. You could feel it settle into your chest, nestle into your ribs, and stir your dreams. That morning, 4 people didn't wake. Their skin was pink, their breath slow but steady. They weren't dead, but neither were they reachable. Eyes closed, expressions serene, arms folded as if asleep in a cradle. When Martha shook them, they didn't stir. When Samuel shouted, they didn't flinch. They simply slept beside the tunnel, curled close to it like children tucked against a mother's skin. The others dragged the sleepers to the far end of the cabin, laid them out on straw mats, whispered prayers. But every few hours they'd find another, a boy nodding off mid-step, a woman whose head lolled near the hearth and would not rise again. One man, Owen Talbot, passed out while standing, his boots steaming from the floor beneath him. He hit the ground with a soft thud and never moved again, mouth open in a faint smile. It was Samuel who noticed the pattern. "They're all the ones who sleep near the breach," he said. "Closer they are to the heat, the deeper they go." Into what? Martha asked. He didn't answer, just shook his head and stared down at his shaking hands. They're not dying, she said firmly. No, he whispered. They're sinking. By the 9th day, the town outside had gone silent. The storm continued to rage, but not a single soul came knocking. Martha watched from the upper window through a frost-smudged pane as chimney smoke ceased rising from rooftops, as the snow swallowed fences and wagons and wheelbarrows whole. Every road in and out of the valley vanished. There were no more visitors, no more gawkers. Only the ones already inside remained, and the tunnel, which now glowed at night, its golden light had become constant, no longer pulsing, but radiating outward like a sun beneath the floorboards. It painted the ceiling in soft amber, cast strange shadows across faces, made even the sound of breath feel deliberate, rhythmic. People began whispering in their sleep, not murmurs, words, some in languages no one recognized, others repeating things no one admitted saying aloud. Below, one woman said again and again. Below, below. It sees, it breathes, below. Another man clutched his chest and whispered, We were wrong. It's not a tunnel, it's a mouth. That evening, the breach opened wider. No one had touched it, but somehow the floor sagged around it. Boards creaked and groaned as the stones below shifted, as if the earth itself had exhaled, and the structure above it weakened from the strain. The opening now stretched nearly 5 feet across, rimmed in heat-cracked timber and fine ash. No fire, no sound, just light and a smell, not smoke, not rot, but something older, sweeter, like wet stone and honey, like breath from a place no sun has touched. Samuel Judd refused to come near it anymore. I've seen this before, he said to Martha, knuckles white on his knees. Where? He looked at her, hollow-eyed. In the mines, when we dug too deep, when the air changed, we thought it was just pressure, but it wasn't. What was it? He didn't speak, just pointed toward the floor with a trembling hand. There are places under the earth that still remember the first fire, before man, before God. That heat we're feeling, it's not fuel, it's memory, and you gave it a tongue. Martha didn't believe him, not at first, but that night she heard her husband. The sound came just before sleep, low, familiar, the rasp of his voice as he coughed in their final days together. Then the sound of him humming, off-key, broken, but a tune she hadn't heard since he lay dying beside her. She sat up fast, heart hammering. Someone had left the hatch to the breach uncovered again, and from beneath the floor drifted the sound of her name, not shouted, whispered. Martha! She stepped closer. Kneeling at the edge of the breach, she peered down. The glow remained soft. The stones glistened like wet teeth. The heat licked at her cheeks, curling the hairs on her arms. She saw no figure, no shape, but she heard it again. Martha, you left me cold, she gasped. The voice was exactly his, down to the break in the last syllable, the tremble in the vowels, the ache. She leaned in. Samuel, she called. Come here, now. He rose from the cot, wary, blinking against the golden haze. Tell me I'm not losing my mind, she whispered. He stepped beside her and looked down into the light. Then he froze. What do you hear? She asked. He didn't answer, just wept. Tears slid down his cheeks, his jaw trembling. What do you hear? She demanded. He looked at her with broken eyes. My daughter. She's been gone 20 years, but she's down there. I heard her say, Papa, it's warm now. Martha stumbled back from the breach, because she understood then. This thing beneath them wasn't just breathing heat, it was breathing memory and longing, and those who got too close weren't falling asleep. They were being drawn inward, not killed, claimed. By dawn, 2 more people had gone into the breach. Not by accident, they walked in. Martha found their boots near the edge, neatly placed, as if removed before entering sacred ground. No screams, no struggle, just warmth, acceptance, and an empty bedroll. Samuel began making plans to leave. We can't stay, he told her. The snow's thinning. We'll take what we can carry, head west, cut across the frozen creek. If we leave it alone, maybe it'll go quiet. It won't, she said. He grabbed her arm. You've got to close it, stone it shut, fill it with earth. But she just looked at the breach, and the heat it gave, and the faces sleeping peacefully around her. The next day, one of the sleepers spoke. They hadn't stirred in days, bodies still, breath low, skin dewy from the radiant warmth. But then the boy, Jameson Carter, 12 years old, opened his eyes. They weren't the same eyes, too wide, too calm, as if he wasn't looking at the room, but at something else, far off, deep below. It's building something, he said. Martha knelt beside him. What is? He smiled. The old fire, the one from before. Before what? Before we were cold. His mouth curled upward. He took her hand and pressed it to his chest. You gave it breath, he said, and then he closed his eyes again and didn't speak for 2 more days. That night, the final storm came. It began with silence. No wind, no snow, just a strange stillness, the kind of hush that comes before a landslide. Martha stepped outside and looked up. The sky had no stars, no clouds, just a dull golden haze, like the light from the breach had finally reached the heavens. And then the ground trembled, not a quake, but a slow undulation, a stretching. Inside, the walls groaned, the windows fogged from heat. People cried out, children clung to strangers. The floorboards bulged, not from pressure, but from something beneath, pressing upward. Samuel shouted to run, but the door wouldn't open. The heat had sealed it shut. The hinges steamed, the walls wept, and the breach at the center of the cabin now shone like a sunrise. Something was coming, something vast, something that had slumbered for longer than bones had names. Martha stood at the center of the room, arms outstretched, eyes wild with both terror and awe, and the voice came again. "Thank you," it said, from below, and then from inside her own chest. She stood in the heat that no longer resembled anything earthly. Every window of the cabin had turned golden from the inside out, casting long fingers of amber light into the snow-packed dark. The air no longer smelled of wood smoke or wet wool or cooking fat. It smelled ancient, like the dust that settles on bones never buried, like clay warmed before fire ever had a name. It clung to the skin, not in sweat, but in memory. Martha Jane Elwood stood barefoot at the edge of the breach, a dress soaked through with steam, hands trembling at her sides. Behind her, the others had gone silent. Some still lay in sleep, peaceful, unmoving, mouths parted slightly like infants in cradles. Others knelt in quiet prayer, or sat with heads bowed, their faces bathed in the light like men who'd finally found something bigger than God and more forgiving. Only Samuel Judd remained on, his feet, his eyes bloodshot, hair wild with fear and ash, back pressed to the cabin wall, as though distance alone could keep him untouched. He wasn't praying, he was watching, and he was whispering to himself in a language even he no longer seemed to recognize. "Martha," he croaked, "you have to stop this." She didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the breach. "The snow's melting," he said, voice cracking. "I saw the creek. It's running again. We can go. Right now. We'll take the child, Jameson, and we'll go west, just like we said." Still, she didn't move. He took a step closer, then froze, because the floor beneath him throbbed. Once, a long, slow heave, like the belly of some vast beast, turning in its sleep. And from the breach came a sound, not loud, not sharp, but deep, steady, familial, like the slow inhale of something that remembered you, that remembered all of you, your words, your blood, your losses. "You said you built it for your husband," Samuel said, voice shaking. "I did," she whispered. "You said it was just a rabbit run for heat." "It was. Then what is it now?" Martha looked up at him finally, and her eyes were wet, but not with tears, with light. That golden hue now lived in her irises, as if the warmth itself had taken up residence behind her gaze. "It's a promise," she said. "Kept." The breach yawned wider. No longer a hole, it had become a chamber, a cavity beneath the cabin floor, lined with smoothed stone and packed clay, the ancient earth exhaling soft tendrils of light like breath from a cradle. The tunnel that once carried warmth had thickened, deepened, expanded. Now it felt less like a passage and more like an invitation. Samuel dropped to his knees. He couldn't bear the weight of the heat anymore. Not physically, not spiritually. His body trembled with it, his skin flushed, and his heart thudded like a war drum in a cave. "I can't," he wheezed. "I can't move." "You're not meant to," she said. "What have you done?" Martha stepped to him, touched his face. "It asked me what I wanted," she said. "It asked me what I missed most, and I said I wanted them warm. I wanted them all warm. The sick, the old, the children, the ones who couldn't dig or split wood or barter for coal. I just wanted them to be held, even in the ground." Samuel gripped her wrist. "This ain't warmth. It's something wearing warmth like a mask." "I know," she said, "and it wears it well." Outside, the storm cracked, not ended, cracked, a sound like ribs splitting open, a gust of wind that carried no snow, only silence, a hush across the valley, as if the sky itself had opened its eyes for the first time in centuries. The chimney of the Elwood cabin collapsed inward, stone drawn down, as if by gravity, and the walls began to breathe, literally. Timber joints flexed, nails groaned, beams pulsed as though wrapped around the belly of something rising slowly from beneath, something ancient and sleepless and enormous. Inside the cabin, no one screamed, because by now they were used to it, because the warmth had stopped being something outside of them. They had been breathing it too long. Now they breathed with it. One by one, the sleepers rose, not by command, by instinct. A toddler padded across the floor, barefoot, no frostbite, no trembling. A woman who had not moved in days stood, eyes still shut, hands open at her sides. The Carter boy opened his mouth and sang, not a song with melody, but a note so pure and low it rattled nails in the rafters. Samuel tried to crawl. Martha placed a hand on his shoulder. "No more fire," she said. "No more chopping. No more ash. Just warmth. For everyone." He looked up at her, tears steaming on his cheeks. "You traded us for a furnace that remembers names." "I traded nothing," she said. "I built a tunnel. I fed it with kindness, and it gave back more than I could hold." "Then what is it doing now?" he asked, voice cracking. She turned toward the breach, and from within, a hand emerged. It wasn't flesh, it wasn't bone, it was light, shaped like memory, like intention. A hand-shaped glow, formed from the same golden pulse that had haunted the floor for days, rose slowly from the mouth of the breach and reached for Martha. It didn't grasp, didn't clutch, just waited. She stepped forward. Samuel screamed, "No, Martha, don't!" She turned to him once more, her silhouette limned in warmth, her voice soft but unwavering. "This was never madness," she said. "It was never grief. It was hope, built in stone and sweat and love. And hope is a living thing. If you give it space, it breathes." She took the hand and vanished. The cabin did not collapse. It did not explode or fall into the earth. Instead, it opened. The floor spread wide like the petals of some massive flower, revealing not a hole but a vast chamber below, glowing, breathing, living. The walls of the room pulsed in tandem with the golden haze, and the sleepers stepped forward without fear. They went willingly, one after another. Jameson Carter, Hetty Ward's grandson, Owen Talbot's wife, all of them, faces serene, as though returning somewhere they'd once been taken from too early. Even Samuel finally crawled to the edge. He didn't stand, didn't speak, just lay on his belly and looked down into that golden place below, and he whispered, "Is this where you went, Annie?" And the light answered. Days later, the storm ended. Travelers found the cabin standing tall, undisturbed, chimney gone, roof faintly steaming under clear blue skies. No footprints surrounded it, no smoke, no voices, just warmth, radiating outward like a hearth too big for its stonework. Birds nested in the porch beams, snow melted in a perfect circle 50 feet wide, and from beneath the threshold, a soft breeze rose, gentle, fragrant, human. Inside, there were no bodies, no sign of struggle, only blankets folded neatly, boots placed in pairs, and in the center of the floor, a wide ring of stone where the boards had once been. Still warm, still breathing, still waiting. They called it madness for a time. They said the Elwood woman had burned her home from below, said she'd gone wild with grief and dragged the townsfolk with her, said she'd uncovered poison gas, or old mine heat, or witchfire. But none of the theories held, because every time someone stepped into the cabin they wept. They didn't know why, but they did. And every time someone left the cabin they were changed, gentler, softer, as if something inside them had thawed and begun moving again. Some called it haunted, some called it holy, but everyone agreed it was warm, so warm you could forget what winter felt like. They never rebuilt the cabin. They left it as it was, a kind of shrine. They brought gifts, scraps of cloth, iron nails, children's drawings, laid them at the threshold. Sometimes the gifts would vanish overnight. Sometimes the warmth would surge outward briefly, like a thank you. Always the wind that followed smelled faintly of honey and ash, and the inside of your grandmother's arms. And deep below, the tunnel still ran, breathing, waiting, remembering the woman who had dared to ask, "Where do you go, little rabbit?" and dared to follow the answer.